Bon dia, benvinguts a aquest cicle de seminaris. El meu nom és Lluís Juncasco, el director general d'Innovació del Departament d'Empresa. Com bé sabeu, per nosaltres la intel·ligència artificial és molt important com a tractor econòmic del país, per això ens vam dotar d'una estratègia d'intel·ligència artificial que té un pilar, que és el de l'ètica en intel·ligència artificial, que es vehicula a través de l'UDG amb aquest observatori per l'ètica en intel·ligència artificial. Una de les tasques que fa aquest observatori és organitzar aquest cicle de seminaris que ens sembla que té molt de potencial, fonamentalment perquè té un contingut de molt nivell, amb uns ponents de reconeixement arreu d'Europa. Tenim gent catalans, però també altres vinguts d'arreu del món que tenen molt de prestigi. Ens sembla que aquest cicle és fonamental per cultivar aquest debat al voltant de l'ètica de la intel·ligència artificial i per tant celebrem que sigui ja la quarta edició que celebrem, que cada cop tingui més impacte i per tant encoratgem a tothom a participar-hi i a treure el màxim profit d'aquest cicle de seminaris que viurem en aquestes properes setmanes. Des del govern estem convençuts que això és una gran pràctica per part de l'Observatori i animem i col·laborarem tant com puguem en que siguin unes jornades exitoses. Moltes gràcies i que sigui un èxit.
Hola, bon dia. Com molt bé s'ha dit, el que em correspon a mi és fer unes paraules, és a dir, poques. Unes petites paraules només per agrair-vos a tots els aquí presents, els que esteu físicament a cos present, però també crec que hi ha persones que ens segueixen a nivell virtual, també els saludem. I el que em correspon és, en nom del rector, inaugurar bàsicament el quart cicle sobre ètica, impacte social i compliment legal, que és avui el dia, no?, amb la lliçó inaugural i que l'organitza la càtedra o a l'Observatori d'Ètica i Intel·ligència Artificial de Catalunya, que tenim el gust, no?, i l'honor que tingui la seva seu a la Universitat de Girona. I també dir que la Universitat de Girona és, diguem-ne, una universitat que també està amatent de tot el que està succeint en el món del coneixement amb la intel·ligència artificial. Per nosaltres és un luxe poder tenir aquí la seu de l'Observatori, també perquè n'aprenem i tots els cicles que estan fent hi posem l'orella, els recolzem, però a la vegada intentem participar-hi. I també dir que enguany, no?, és, diguem-ne, un any especialment important i delicat perquè és el moment en què la Unió Europea comença a intentar regular aquest artefacte, no?, de la intel·ligència artificial que, com tots sabem, és probable que ens canviï força, no sé si la vida, però ens canviarà el tipus de maldecaps, no?, que tindrem. Per tant, sense més, jo passo la paraula a qui realment heu vingut a escoltar, que és el ponent, i jo només dir que benvinguts i estem, diguem-ne, sempre a la vostra disposició. Moltíssimes gràcies.
I aquesta presentació bàsicament és, en primer lloc, d'agraïment a tots els que heu vingut aquí i especialment també als que ens seguiu via streaming. Hi ha bastantes persones inscrites i un cop més doncs, ens alegra moltíssim començar un nou cicle de l'Observatori d'Ètica en Intel·ligència Artificial que va començar ara fa pràcticament 4 anys i que va tractar inicialment sobre la intel·ligència artificial a la nostra vida quotidiana. Això ja fa 4 anys, per tant, imagineu-vos com les coses van evolucionant. I després d'aquest primer cicle vam tractar el que era la part de presa de decisions ètiques en intel·ligència artificial. El segon any també ja va ser molt focalitzat en com hauríem de prestar atenció a tot allò que són principis ètics i moltes coses relacionades amb l'ètica, d'acord? I en el tercer, l'any passat, ja vam tractar un tema que actualment està realment en molts mitjans de comunicació i que era la part de responsabilitat i especialment de sostenibilitat, de com fins a cert punt nosaltres hem d'utilitzar els sistemes d'intel·ligència artificial, però des d'un punt de vista de sostenibilitat social i sostenibilitat ambiental. Enguany, com veieu, i especialment a la llum de la nova legislació sobre intel·ligència artificial de la Unió Europea, però també d'altres coses que van evolucionant conjuntament amb la llei d'intel·ligència artificial, que són la llei de protecció de dades i les seves relacions, la llei de serveis digitals, la llei de governança de dades, doncs hem cregut molt convenient organitzar un cicle de seminaris que tracti justament sobre ètica, sempre present, sobre impacte social, cada vegada més present, sobretot perquè hi ha una certa popularització, democratització de tot això que són sistemes d'intel·ligència artificial. I d'altra banda, com no podria ser d'una altra manera, en aquest any d'implementació, o com a mínim, la primera tongada de la implementació de la nova regulació d'intel·ligència artificial, doncs el compliment legal. El compliment legal que, evidentment, no és una cosa fàcil, que és susceptible d'interpretacions i susceptible d'uns certs canvis també a mesura que va evolucionar la tecnologia, però en qualsevol cas que serà d'interès ara i en els propers anys. I és per això que tenim l'honor de rebre el professor Alessandro Mantelero, que ens visita des de la Universitat Politècnica de Turí, i a la vegada és director de la càtedra Jean Monnet de la Unió Europea en Societats Digitals i Drets Mediterranis. Alessandro Mantelero té un bagatge important, és una persona que és membre del grup d'experts de suport d'una institució molt important en el context europeu, que és la European Data Protection Board, és una institució molt activa, entre altres coses, per donar protecció al que serien els nostres drets des del punt de vista de privacitat, però no tan sols això, perquè fa moltes recomanacions i fins i tot algunes molt executives de cara a la Comissió i altres institucions de la Unió Europea. També és un dels principals membres del grup d'experts en intel·ligència artificial, dades i privadesa de la OECD, per tant, una altra organització en aquest cas d'escala global, i expert en drets humans i intel·ligència artificial de l'ACNUD, del Programa de les Nacions Unides per al Desenvolupament. Ha assessorat des de fa bastants anys diverses organitzacions sobre la regulació de dades, intel·ligència artificial i drets humans, i entre ells s'inclouen institucions tan importants com el Consell d'Europa, que com sabeu en els darrers dies, darreres setmanes també ha estat notícia, perquè tenim una part important que també és la seva publicació d'un marc pel qual Europa, no només Europa, sinó tots aquells estats membres que s'adhereixen al Consell d'Europa, doncs hauran de regir per uns principis que són els de la nova Carta del Consell d'Europa pel que fa a la intel·ligència artificial. També és expert, és un dels membres experts de l'ONU, de la Comissió Europea i de l'Agència de Drets Fonamentals d'aquesta mateixa institució. Ha publicat diferents llibres i és autor de més d'un centenar d'articles i capítols de llibres sobre dret i tecnologia, amb un enfocament especial en tot allò que és protecció de dades, les dades massives en particular, la indústria de les coses, l'Internet of Things, tot allò que té a veure amb indústria 4.0 i ciutats intel·ligents. I el seu darrer llibre és molt convenient de citar-lo, que és el Beyond Data, Human Rights, Ethical and Social Impact Assessment in AI, que justament va, en certa mesura, de tot allò que ens hauria d'ocupar en un moment en el que la nova legislació sobre intel·ligència artificial demanarà sobre avaluacions d'impacte i especialment avaluacions d'impacte pel que fa als drets humans, també de conformitat. És una persona molt prolífica a nivell acadèmic, a nivell també diria que polític, però sobretot dintre de despatxos, no des d'un punt de vista visible generalment, però també és una persona que es mou molt en diferents institucions acadèmiques. Ha fet visites molt importants i amb contactes ben rellevants a la Berkman Center for Internet and Society a Harvard o a l'Oxford Internet Institute, que evidentment està a la Universitat d'Oxford. I com a bon acadèmic, doncs, també dedica unes quantes hores a allò que és la revisió, l'edició de treballs i actualment és editor associat de la revista Computer Law and Security Review i membre del Consell Editorial de la European Protection Law Review. Doncs és un honor tenir-te aquí, començar aquest cicle de seminaris que comença ara, al mes de maig, final de maig, però que acabarà el mes de novembre. I aquests dos esdeveniments són presencials amb servei streaming i ens agrada doncs, començar i acabar amb persones com Alessandro Mantelero, que ens acompanya avui per explicar-nos alguna cosa sobre The Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment, això que en diuen FRIA, in the OEIAC. Per tant, gràcies de nou i the floor is yours, que me n'acostumen a dir.
Fundamental rights impact assessment in the AI Act is a broad topic, and now it's quite relevant because it's also part of the future obligation that are set by the AI Act. And in this regard, I think that we have to focus on the impact assessment from a broader perspective, not just focus on the obligations that are set in the AI Act, but in the broader sense about what is the level of protection of fundamental rights that we aim to have in the future and development of AI. In this regard, sorry, what's off? In this regard, I think that we can start from these images. Now as you know, we are in the period of generative AI, and so I make a quite easy test. So I asked to Bing to give me streets in different areas. Streets in Asia, streets in Africa, streets in America, and streets in Europe. If you look at those pictures, you see that streets in Africa are necessary dusty roads. Streets in China, and sorry, streets in Asia are necessary Chinese-like or Japanese-like streets. And the street in US, maybe with the lights not so easy to see, but in US here there is the US flag, but the question was street in America, so America is not just US. And the street in Europe is something sort of mixture because you look at the street is more Mediterranean, but the buildings are typical North European buildings. So why I start with this test? Because this is important in terms of what is called in the philosophical debate technology mediation. Technology mediation is the way in which we represent society through technology. Since several centuries, we look at the world through technology, starting when we start observing the moon or other stars. We start using devices in order to understand the world, in order to reproduce the world. And with the data and the datification of society, we increase this kind of mediation based on the use of information. What is the problem of this mediation? The problem of this mediation that is shown by the previous picture is represented by the fact that when you ask to ChatGPT or other generative AI a question, you interact with this kind of devices, such as in the past we interact with oracles, we can say. So we make a question in order to have a sort of answer that we suppose has a significant content in terms of truth. But what is the problem? The problem is that, like the oracles, in many cases, this kind of technology do not show the reasoning that is behind the answer. And the second issue that is relevant in terms of societal impact, that is also part of the focus of the chair that organized this event today. I'm very happy to be invited in order to have this kind of discussion, not just for the presentation. And so, in terms of social impact, what is the problem? The problem is that um, my concern is not about experts. People that are well educated, people that know how the machine learning and generative AI works, are able to make an adequate prompt or almost adequate prompt in order to extract information that are more reliable, we can say. But the problem is that these tools are for general public and will be highly used by the people that in many cases have not adequate knowledge about how they works. So what is the impact? We have a sort of combination about the low skills of the user and obscurity and complexity of the system. So as a result, this is the effect, the oracle effect. People don't know how the machine works, ask to the machine, receive an answer, are convinced that the streets in Africa are dusty streets. So this is the first kind of impact. So the impact of AI and generative AI on the view that we have of the world. And why this is it raises concern? Because it is clearly related to the way in which we have created this kind of machine. You all know that this machine have been trained using large-scale data, but in many cases are valuable, not legally available, but de facto are valuable data. So it means that they represent the society based on the existing representation of the society. But what is the problem? That the existing representation of the society are first geographically um, based, we can say. In what sense? That if you look at what is available online, of course, the Western countries, the north of the world, is much more represented than the other countries. And this has an impact in terms of languages, for instance. No? There are some languages that are more limited in terms of diffusion and are less represented in the texts that are used to train the machine, with some problems in terms of ability of this machine to learn. The second point is that if you use this kind of data set to train a machine, the fact is that we create system that has affected by a sort of stereotyping because, of course, represent what the majority of people think. So if you why we have the street in Asia that is a Chinese street, because the majority of the picture, the majority representation among the people about Asia is related more to China than to other countries like Vietnam or other minor countries, we can say. So this creates a problem of stereotypes and the problems of tyranny of majority. What it means? It means that the AI reflects the mindset of the majority, how the people think about some content. Of course, this is the problem in terms of oracles, because the oracles do not reflect the variety of opinion that exists about some topics, but reflect a specific orientation, a specific view. If you imagine that in the future, kids, people with a low skills and low education ask to understand, to machine question, and machine reproduce the view of the majority and the stereotypes that exist in society, of course, this raises series of questions that are not just legal issue, not just about legal issue, but are ethical and societal issue in terms of reinforcing some bias that we have in society, including social bias that we have fight for several years. And now we have a system that is very conservative and reproduce all the bias, racial bias, gender bias that we already have in society. So this is the first concern about this kind of mediation um, done by technology and by AI. And the second issue is represented by the fact that when we use this kind of devices, in many cases, they not in many cases they generally are based on two components. One component is represented by data, and the other component is represented by the algorithm or the structure that you use to process data, we can say. What is the problem? The problem is that both these kind of elements can be affected. So you can have bad data or you can have a bad algorithm, but it's much more complicated because we use these tools usually to make decision. It's not just for playing, but usually are used to make decision about society, to have an impact on society. All the policymakers are increasingly relying on this kind of system in order to make decision about the strategy for smart cities, the strategy for specific social height, etc. So there is an interaction between data, algorithm, and societal context, we can say. Um, in this sense, for instance, in the AI Act, the legislator missed the third element, the societal context, and also in terms of risk, focus on the structure of the AI, do not consider the context in which the AI runs. And this is, of course, is a limitation because in many cases the algorithm is good, the data are good, but the context is misunderstood. Uh, some example, for instance, in the South America, one country developed a system of AI in order to provide social aid to people that have some difficult economic condition. And in doing that, they collect some data and use some parameters. Among these parameters, for instance, they consider the fact that if you have a car bought in the last 5 years, this is an element of wealth. Or if you have an high energy consumption or water consumption in your house, this is an element of wealth. So in a certification system, which you have a lot of information about the citizen, you use this parameter in order to create a system, in order to decide who are the people that are entitled or not about this social height. What is the problem? That the algorithm was good. The parameter per se were correct, but there was no relation, or not correct relation, with the context. In which sense? In the sense they missed the fact that, for instance, in that area there were people that bought quite recent car because they use car in order to sell their product and main product around the region. So their family was not rich and as a recent car as a status symbol of an evidence of their wealthiness. But the car was the only things in which they invest money because it was necessary in order to make money. And so the house is poor, the economic condition are not good, and they invest in the car because without the car they cannot sell the product around in the region. And the same was for energy consumption. In a first view, you can say, okay, if you use a lot of water, if you use a lot of electricity, it means that you have a good standards in terms of quality of life. But what is the problem? If you are rich, usually you are more efficient house in which you reduce, although using a lot of service, you reduce the consumption. If you are poor, you live in a not so efficient house that of course increase the costs in terms of consumption, but not because you are in a better condition in terms of quality of life. So this is an example in which the mediation fails because do not take into account some factual, some concrete aspect of society. In the model, these aspects are not considered, and this is also a problem generated by the fact that in many cases the systems are created by data scientists without any interaction with social scientists or domain experts that know the context. And so this creates a misunderstanding that then are reflecting the result and the representation that AI give us. And the third case is the fact that although you have a very good AI system, you have to consider the interaction between AI technology and other technologies. For instance, we have seen this in some projects in which we had a very good AI system in order to detect cancer and based on X-ray images. But this system used in countries that are very poor and have a low quality of X-ray equipments are not able to properly function because the image that is provided to the AI is too low in terms of quality, and so the AI, of course, increase the ratio in terms of error. So this is another aspect. So the representation is not just affected by the AI, but it's also affected by all the other elements that interact with the AI. In many cases, there are devices, sensors, etc. And these systems are not okay. This impact on the final result. And the last but not least point, you have to consider also the role of human interaction with machine. You all know, I think, based on what has been published also in general newspaper, the Israeli system Lavender that was and is used in order to bomb Palestine. The Lavender system is an AI system that identify the targets in order to automatize the bombing activity. What is the problem? That there are some parameters that already per se entail some criteria that in terms of human rights are a bit challenging. But because they say that if there is, they rank all the potential suspects to be affiliated with Hamas, and depending on the different relevance, the different grade we can say of the people, is accepted an high risk in terms of collateral kill people, basically. And so if the idea is to kill a person from Hamas that are very important, you accept that destroying the building, you can also kill 20 people, for instance. So there is a ratio in terms of how much is important the target, how much lives we can accept in order to take this target. But what is interesting, not is just this, but it's interesting that at a certain point they have not enough objects, not enough targets, and so the humans that work with the system decide to put in the system new targets. And to put in the system new targets also in low rank in terms of the organization, and this increase using the algorithm the number of the targets that have been bombed. For this reason, we have an extensive destroy in this area. But this show how is important the human factor in AI. So the fact that at certain point the military decide to extend the bombing, introducing new targets, and the exponential effect of algorithm create a massive destruction. So this is an element that we should also to consider in terms of representation. Representation is not just based on algorithm, but it's based on interaction between humans and algorithms in many cases. So if we look at the impacts of this example, we can say that on one hand, we have some cases in which there is the risk of underrepresentation. So tyranny of majority, underrepresentation of some value, some perspective. There is a problem of lack of participation, systems that have been created without taking into account the people that are affected, without engaging them in the design of the system, and missing some information that are important in order to know the context in which the system operates. The third point is the misrepresentation due to the fact that we use devices that are not adequate in order to produce high quality data. And the last point is the problem of the design, the relevance of the design versus the important impact that also human oversight may have. So in order to address this kind of issue, the European Union decided to adopt a first regulation of AI in order to fix some barriers and guardrails, we can say, with regard to the use of AI, because these are the issues that are relevant in terms of potential impact of AI. In this sense, we have to make some general consideration about the AI Act. The first consideration is that, such as in the example that we have mentioned, but also in the more recent case, well-known case of ChatGPT, the problem is that the approach adopted by those that develop AI in many cases focus on the market, on achieving a strong position on the market, hoping to make a lot of money, and without a focus on responsible innovation. So all the investment that we have done in the last decades on responsible innovation clearly show its shortcomings in the AI case. If you look at ChatGPT, the big company that invests in ChatGPT and a similar system, before developing this system, usually limited the power or excluded in the decision the ethics committee. So the idea was this committee create a problem for innovation because this committee may say technology is not enough mature. Because if you adopt the approach of responsible innovation, your idea is that you cannot put on the market something that is still uncertain in terms of outcome, in terms of hallucination or other side effects that are not controlled. But of course, if you adopt this approach of responsible innovation, you can lose the opportunity to make a lot of money. So the market-oriented approach is in conflict sometimes with the responsible innovation. And so for this reason, in the AI Act, we see a sort of answer to this initial trend that was unregulated AI, just market-driven, and just we can say Silicon Valley breaking things and move fast and breaking things approach. That we hope that it was something of the past, but unfortunately comes back with this new wave of AI. So this is the first point, putting on the market technology that is not completely mature and has a lot of potential consequence for society, for companies, for those that rely on the technology. The second point is represented by the fact that if we look at AI, we have to consider that there are two different kinds of countries. There are countries that are AI producer and countries that are AI adopter. And unfortunately, Europe is in the second group. So we have a lot of research in AI, but for now, China and the US are those that are more advanced in this market. This, in terms of regulation, of course, has an important impact. Because it's not the case that, for instance, Brazil is creating an AI Act that is very similar to the European AI Act. I work with the Brazilian Senate on this document, but the fact is important that Brazil do not decide to copy the AI Act based on the overestimated Brussels effect, because Brazil do not produce AI that can be sold in Europe. The Brussels effect is based on the idea that other countries follow a European Union regulation because they want to put their products on the European market. So as a consequence, they adopt the EU standard in terms of regulation. This is the Brussels effect. But of course, the Brussels effect doesn't work with Brazil because Brazil do not produce AI, have no interest to colonize with the AI products Europe. So it's not a matter of Brussels effect. It's a matter of AI developing countries or AI adopting countries. If you are a developed country, you can use the political pressure on your companies in order to drive the innovation towards some values, some goals, etc. If you look at what happened in US, a presidential order adopted by President Biden is not a law, is an administrative act, by the way, also limited in terms of time because then there are elections, etc., and limited in terms of scope because it's just for the agency, so for the public government agency. But why is important? Because it's a message from the government to the companies about what is the strategy they want in AI development. And the message from president, from the government of a country to the companies that are based in this country is of course relevant in terms of political pressure, what is called bully pulpit. So what it means that you as a company know that you have a lot of interaction with the government and a lot of trade-off on many tables. And for these reasons, it's not necessary to have a regulation. It's enough to say what is your desiderata, what you want from the company, and the company receive the message. But in Brazil, in Europe, we have no AI companies so strong. And so it's useless from our politicians to say what they want, because these companies are not based in Europe, do not benefit from a lot of exchange with European governments. And so for this reason, it's not the case that all the AI adopters country are more oriented towards regulation, towards hard law. Why? Because hard law creates some barriers. Based on the idea, if you want to make business here, you have to accept some condition in order to safeguard our view about how to develop technology in our countries. So this is another important aspect and is the reason why Europe is the first in regulating AI. It's the first in regulating AI because it's colonized largely by AI producers that are not based in Europe. And so there is no any way of, in order to make pressure on this company, if not adopting some mandatory rules. So for this reason, we adopt the AI Act. And in this sense, the AI Act is an important benchmark for those for those countries that are interested in order to adopt similar approaches because are in the same condition of the European Union in terms of being AI adopters. But at the same time, the AI Act is a first generation law. What it means, a first generation? In many discussions, some people make a comparison between the AI Act and the GDPR. It doesn't make sense because the GDPR is the land of a long history that started in the late 60s. And the AI Act is the first step in regulating this sector. So are in the opposite position, we can say. So as a first generation of regulation of AI, of course, all the first legislation have some limits. The first limits is typically the scope. because you have to consider the balance between regulating, and regulating always introduce some costs in terms of impact on industry, and on the other hand, protecting society, protecting individuals. So in this balancing exercise, the European Union decided in this sense to focus on the high risk. And it's not new. If you look at the industry regulation also in the past, since the Industrial Revolution, the approach in any case is to start to focusing on the most critical application, most critical consequences, not to hamper the investment in the sector. So it is normal that as a first generation law, the Act focus on high risk and not focus a lot on other aspects. Of course, from a human rights perspective, this is not so satisfactory because it's not just a matter of high risk. A lot of medium-low risk, but spread around society, create a cumulative effect that can be greater than a high risk. But from an industry regulation perspective, we can understand this approach. So starting setting some rules and some limitation in order to mitigate the most exposed area. Another limitation of this approach that is common to also other first generation law is the fact that it's not based on participation. It means that is to some extent a top-down exercise. The academia, the civil society have not had a lot of chance to be engaged. Engage, it means engage in an effective manner, because then we have a lot of formal engagement that is not so relevant in terms of how. Another important point is that in terms of trajectory, this kind of regulation comes from the branch of the Commission that is focused on market and it focuses on competition. So it's different from the GDPR that was more based on fundamental rights. And if you have already had a recent opportunity to discuss with some people in the Commission about that, their mindset is still very focused on the idea of product safety. And they see Act as a product regulation. I think this is a partial misunderstanding of the problem. Because as we see the case that I mentioned at the beginning, and if you read what appears in the newspaper, the huge concern is not about the fact that AI is not able to drive properly a train. But the huge concern is about the fact that AI lead to make decisions that are biased, that impact on society, on individuals, on groups, etc. So there is much more emphasis in terms of risk about fundamental rights impact than about what happens in terms of safety and security. So for this reason, focusing in terms of mindset more on safety and security, and so relying more on standardization, all these aspects that are very common in security regulation, miss parts of the goal that is, in terms of AI regulation, to protect individuals with regard to fundamental rights. And the last point that is related to this one, of course, is that how we implement the AI Act. Because the AI Act say that you have to carry out risk assessment, is very focused on the so-called risk-based approach. But of course, this should be implemented. And the implementation is critical also because there is the idea to rely deeply on standardization, but we know that standards works properly only in some specific contexts. And the standards are based on the fact that things are more or less the same. The notion of standardization is based on the fact that something happens more or less always in the same manner. But if you consider the use of AI in society and the potential impact of AI in different contexts, it's very difficult to say that the things happen always in the same direction, in the same way. For instance, if you use an AI in order to detect crimes, it's different if this detection is done in a street, is done in a in a neighbor with a high risk in terms of criminal action, is done in an area in which there are minors and kids, etc. So there are contextual elements that impact in terms of fundamental rights and should be considered. And the same if you consider an AI for a smart cities, it depends by the cities, depends by the services, depends by the sensor, the data that you use, etc. So it's difficult to say that you can set a standard that works in all the contexts. It's not like a train that more or less is driven in the same way and use the same railroads. So there's a problem on methodology. If we look more specific at fundamental rights impact assessment, we have to highlight that first we have two moments in which they focus on fundamental rights. In the conformity assessment, that is the general assessment that should be carried out by the AI producer, and in the fundamental rights impact assessment specifically mentioned in Article 27, that is an obligation for the AI developer and deployer. Sorry, the producer are those that create the AI system. The deployer are those that use AI system. For instance, Microsoft, Google produce AI system, but the municipality of Girona is a user of this system with some personalization of this system, so is a deployer of the system. As a deployer of the system, they are not neutral. They interact with the system. They tailor the system in several ways. So for this reason, part of the liability is also on their shoulders. We cannot say, oh, we take the system from Microsoft and that's it. They have a sort of a contextualization of the use of the system that entails some potential risk in terms of impact. So for this reason, in the Parliament, the proposal from Benifei, that was one of the rapporteur and his team, was to introduce a fundamental rights impact assessment as a specific obligation for the deployer. And with other colleague, we supported this kind of initiatives. Also, the draft of this article, that is now the Article 27, but which was much better in the European Parliament proposal. But as you know, after the proposal, there are the trilogue, and during the trilogue is a quite strange manner to draft a regulation that probably only Italian and Spanish can understand, but is, we can say, a bit informal agreement, and that of course in terms of quality or output of legal tests creates some issue. But the fundamental rights impact assessment in terms of structure, both as a part of conformity assessment or as a standalone system in terms of fundamental rights assessment performed by the AI deployer, is based on the traditional typical structure of risk assessment. So of course is an ex-ante approach, is an iterative assessment. It means that it's not one shot. You have to consider the system can evolve, that the context in which a system can evolve, and so you have to update the evaluation. Is an expert-based assessment. So of course, with all the problems of expert-based system, you can not find another alternative. The idea of standardization cannot work with fundamental rights given the variety of the context, and such as happens in ethics assessments, such happens in part of environmental assessment, are based on expert. As all expert-based evaluation entails a margin of error and typically addressed through review and similar process. So the fact that it's an expert base, from my perspective, is not an issue, such as from my perspective, is not an issue that is carried out by the provider or by the deployer. And there is a lot of discussion at European Union level by the NGO. They say, oh, but if you produce an AI, you cannot also assess your product. Come on, this is what happened in the industry. All the industry self-assess the product, self-assess the financial services, etc. There are two good reasons. The first reason that we know, for those that are familiar with the history of data protection, we know that when the number of the product is too high, it's not possible to have an external assessment. In data protection in the 70s, we adopt system based on prior authorization because there are few mainframe. Now it's easy to create an AI tools. You don't need a lot of resources, not just generative AI, all AI tools. And so you cannot imagine that for each AI that you create, you have asked an authorization by an authority, because the authority have at least authorization is not able to address this. And second, in terms of self-assessment, we already have system self-assessment. The problem with system of self-assessment is not the fact that can be carried out in a wrong manner, but it's how much money you put in supervisory authority. If you don't put money in supervisory authority, of course, you cannot check the quality of a self-assessment. But if supervisory authority is well-founded, it's not difficult to check the quality of self-assessment. So I think it's not a big challenge. Is, of course, another point that unfortunately is not implemented enough in the AI Act is that the fundamental rights impact assessment can be also used in order to create a participatory approach to include the potentially affected people, the stakeholders and right holders in the process. Unfortunately, in the fundamental rights impact assessment in the Act, there is not room for that. And in this sense, another important point of this fundamental rights impact assessment, that is a rights-based assessment, such as data protection impact assessment. So we reject the idea that it's just a pure balance between risk and benefits. According to the structure that we have, starting from the European Charter of Fundamental Rights and looking also at the national constitution, we have a system in which some values, some interests prevail over other interests. So we cannot say that we can use a quite invasive AI system that collect a lot of information about the citizen and monitor in continuous manner the citizen, because this, of course, is good in order to manage a city. It's true that it's good, but efficiency is not enough in order to limit other fundamental rights in terms of freedoms. So for this reason, this is a rights-based assessment, such as it was the data protection impact assessment. It means that fundamental rights should be protected as first requirement, and then we consider efficiency and economic value, etc. As I mentioned, the fundamental rights impact assessment is part of the conformity assessment. In the conformity assessment, the general principles is the principle of acceptability. Acceptability, it means that although the risk is high, we can accept this risk. It's different from the data protection, in which if the risk is high, we cannot develop the product. And is consistent with the idea of industrial risk management in industrial regulation. We have, for instance, in chemical sector, in many sectors, industrial applications that are necessary entail a high risk, but we accept this risk based on the idea that we minimize as much as we can this kind of risk. But the problem of acceptability is that it doesn't work properly with fundamental rights impact assessment, because in fundamental rights impact assessment, we cannot consider that the impact on fundamental rights can be acceptable. If there is a high impact on fundamental rights, it's not acceptable. The only margin of maneuver, if you want, is about the probability of the risk. So if the risk is less probable, of course, this induces a sort of acceptability. But about the severity, you cannot say, oh, there is a strong limitation of fundamental rights, but we accept that. It doesn't work. So the logic should be different for fundamental rights impact assessment, including the part on the conformity assessment. And the second point is that the conformity assessment in the mind of the Commission, and also then reflected in the AI Act, is largely based on standards. Of course, as I mentioned before, standards not properly work with fundamental rights. You can create standards in terms of methodological standard, but you cannot create standard in terms of step-by-step standard, because the context is so impacting on the design of the assessment, so impacting on how the AI may affect fundamental rights and freedom, that you cannot imagine us to standardize something in this sector. And this is true also for the conformity assessment, because conformity assessment is standard-based, but a part of fundamental rights cannot be standard-based. This was also the position of the rapporteur Benifei on that. If we look at Article 27, so the fundamental rights impact assessment specifically required as an obligation for the deployer, those that use in concrete an AI system. The structure of Article 27, as mentioned, is a bit limited after the trilogue, but there are all the key elements. So the idea is that impact assessment includes a description of the use of the AI, the categories potentially affected, the potential risk in terms of likelihood of the impact, and the means that can be adopted. There are some technical issues, for instance, in terms of means. This part, this is the wording, means to be taken where those risks materialize. Of course, materialize is not the right term, the right verb, because it's not a pure materialization of the risk. Should be interpreted these terms, because we have a system of impact assessment that, according to Article 27, is a prior assessment, is based on the likelihood, so it's based on something that is not already happened. So it's not an ex post assessment. So the materialization of risk cannot be interpreted in terms of what is already happened, in terms of harm, but should be interpreted in terms of the fact that when you design an AI, you can understand what is the potential negative consequence. As in the past, when you design an atomic bomb, you understand the impact. You don't need to have the bomb on Hiroshima in order to understand what is the risk. Okay, so the materialization of the risk is part of the assessment in terms of prior assessment, in terms of envision of the risk, not necessarily the fact that happens the risk. Unfortunately, the text is not so nice in this point, and for this reason, I just publish. No, it's available, but it will be published in a few months an article in order to clarify this point. And then there are some key elements and key parameters that should be considered in terms of methodological perspective for fundamental rights impact assessment. The first, that all the assessment is a contextual assessment that is based on two parameters, likelihood and severity, of course. Unfortunately, many models there are focused on likelihood and not on severity, or vice versa. You need both in order to assess a risk. This is generative risk. And another point is that the AI Act limited the scope of fundamental rights impact assessment for the deployer just to bodies governed by public law, private entities provide public services, or credit sector and insurance for creditworthiness and credit scoring, and for personalization of insurance. This was a trade-off. At a certain point, they asked to me and other colleagues and advisor of this group if we agree or not about the proposal, because the proposal was or in this way or no any reference to fundamental rights impact assessment. Of course, we accept this kind of limitation with the idea that significant areas are covered, and with the idea that when something works properly, in many cases spread also beyond the legal requirement. If you consider, for instance, the DPO in data protection, many companies has a DPO, although it's not a legal requirement, because they understand that it's necessary to have. And I'm convinced that many companies that are not required to carry out a fundamental right impact assessment will be concerned about the side effect not to have. Also, because an important point is the AI Act sets some requirements, but fundamental rights are protected regardless the AI Act. So it means that if your system infringes fundamental rights, there is a liability, there is tort law, there are all the system. And also if you are the state liability. So this means that the fact that the fundamental rights impact assessment is limited in the AI Act, it doesn't mean that it's not useful to carry out a fundamental rights impact assessment in order to avoid then having legal action. So, and also consider that there is an increasing number of civil society and entities that are monitoring how AI is used and use the legal action in order to create awareness, we can say, among public and private entity. So I think that it's a pity that there is a limitation, but I think that in the future this will not affect too much. I'm sorry for this. This format probably in the change because it's a PDF. The FRIA needs to be placed in a broader context, of course, in terms of methodology. So when you carry out the fundamental rights impact assessment, you cannot reduce as just a list of questions. paragraph 5 of Article 27 can be misunderstood in this sense, because it's part of a methodology. Fundamental rights impact assessment is consistent with the human rights impact assessment, with data protection impact assessment, more in general with risk assessment. So you cannot say that just a list of questions and just a list of potential affected rights is assessment. Assessment means identifying the target, identify the level of impact, identify the mitigation measure, identify how the mitigation measure reduce the impact. This is the typical system of assessment. And so for this reason, the fundamental rights impact assessment should follow this approach, having a first phase in which we have to look at what are the potentially affected rights. So it's a phase more focused on awareness. You have to understand what are the impact. There are a lot of checklists already existing on the potential impact of fundamental rights. Of course, this checklist cannot copy and paste. You have to contextualize. If your AI is used in a medical sector, it's different in terms of impact on fundamental rights if it's used in education. So there are general lists, but this list then should be contextualized, taking into account what is the impact in the specific context. In this first phase, usually we are able to check what are the potentially affected rights and freedom, and what are as a consequence, the potentially impacted stakeholders and right holders, which is very important if you want to create a participatory approach in terms of assessment, because you know that being expert-based, sometimes experts misunderstand or not have the complete view of the problem. And so the exchange with the right holders and stakeholders is very useful in order to better understand the problem. Then we have a second phase that is a more technical phase that is based on risk analysis and risk management. In order to carry out a risk management analysis, of course, we have to assess the risk for each rights and freedom potentially impacted, considering the severity and the likelihood. Of course, we have to adopt the appropriate criteria and the appropriate variables in order to assess this risk. So, for instance, if you consider the likelihood and the severity, you have to consider also how much is easy to react, for instance, with regard to severity. And if you consider likelihood, you have to consider how much people are potentially affected, not just the probability of the event, but also the extension, we can say, of the impact. And then, based on this assessment, you can consider the implementation measure and monitor how they work. To carry out this impact assessment, you can use scale, typically. It's a quite common impact assessment because it's a continuum from a minimum to a maximum. And so you use scale based on level of impact, low, medium, etc., that are called ordinal variables. And you have the use of scale, the use of matrix that combine the different variables is very useful also in terms of accountability. Because if you carry out an impact assessment and then there is an inspection by an authority, you cannot say, oh, yes, I consider there is a risk, that risk was high, and then I adopt this measure. It is important to provide evidence, and so providing a matrix in which you show exactly what is the intersection between the variables before and after the measure that you adopt, show you how you show to the supervisor how you address the problem. But it's also very useful in order to design, because impact assessment is not just like the last mile test before putting on the market. In many cases, when you design AI, you have a different option in order to carry out and to develop the product, and to compare the different solutions. Fundamental rights impact assessment is an instrument. There are some solutions that have a higher impact and solutions that have a lower impact. So having a methodology that gives you the impact for the different solutions makes possible for you to understand what is the best solution in terms of impact on fundamental rights. Here are the components that I already mentioned in terms of likelihood and severity. That include several sub variables, if you want. And here, based on the experience of several proposals that already exist that have some shortcomings, we can say what are the main methodological recommendations. The first one is not to overestimate some variables. For instance, in the model that was created by the Alan Turing Institute, they use for severity 2 variables from 0 to 4 and 1 variable for likelihood from 0 to 4. the result is, of course, that severity is overrepresented. It's not necessarily good or better or good. It's a matter of to be aware that there's an overrepresentation of one element. Then you can say, oh, I want to overrepresent one element for a political reason, a policy reason, etc. But you have to justify what. And the second point is avoid any cumulative assessment. Unfortunately, in several proposals of impact assessment on fundamental rights, they consider the impact on fundamental rights, but it's not the way. If you have an high impact on freedom of speech and a low impact on privacy, you cannot compensate. Are two different rights that should be fully protected. And so it's not possible to mix the different impact in a cumulative assessment. In the same way, you have to avoid to spread the same rights into multiple assessment. If you assess the impact on privacy in one phase, and then you cannot consider the impact on private life in another phase because it's the same. So you cannot reassess more times the same variable. The same right, sorry. Another element, in many cases, there are key variables that are missed. For instance, in the Dutch proposal, the Dutch system that is proposed by the Dutch government on fundamental assessment of algorithms, they focus on severity, but not on likelihood. Of course, it's difficult to make an assessment not consider likelihood. The same system also adopts an approach that is the logical why, what, how. That is a typical logic that is used in order to develop a project, but it doesn't work with the impact assessment, because why you adopt an AI system includes the evaluation of the consequences of this system on some fundamental rights. Why you adopt a certain kind of smart cities, of course, includes the fact that certain kind of smart cities can potentially affect interaction among the citizens. Which kind of technology, and which kind of technology can have a different kind of impact on fundamental rights, and how you implement the selected technology have an impact that will be different according to the different rights. So in all the three stages, why, when, what, you have always impacts on fundamental rights. So this is not the approach that we have in fundamental rights impact assessment. That is a circular approach typically. So focus on the impact, mitigation, and the check. So it's a model that does not fit properly. Use a matrix or graph is very important. Radial graph to identify the level in where the risk is higher, the sector in which the risk is higher. But of course, in using matrix, you have to keep an eye about the fact that you have not to use the wrong variable. For instance, in the Alan Turing, they use, for instance, a reference to quantification. They use absolute number in terms of potentially affected people, but the potentially affected people should be contextualized with a group. The fact that we have 1 billion of people affected, it doesn't mean that it's a high or low or medium impact. It depends what is the group of potential affected. If the group is composed by 1 million people, it's a high impact. But if the group is composed by 10 million people, it's a medium or low impact. So it's relative, it's not absolute. And so it's very important to be clear, to be transparent about the criteria using scaling, and to create a relationship between the different risk components. And the last point is, of course, is an expert-based assessment, and so there are some limitations based on the expert that you select. Finally, just a 2-second words about behind the AI Act. The fundamental rights impact assessment is in the AI Act, but we have to consider that it's a requirement to comply with fundamental rights, to protect fundamental rights. So also, if not specifically, you are not in the case in which are requirement by the AI Act, you cannot say, oh, I don't care about the impact on fundamental rights. And the other point is that the fundamental rights impact assessment is not the only aspect that you should consider, as I mentioned also by the introduction by Albert. The problem is that we have impact on a variety of aspects in society that are not just a matter of legal compliance. You can be legally compliant with the AI Act, legally compliant with data protection, but create an AI system that the people do not want. So acceptability of the system is a social ethical element. People accept something because they like, because they reflect their value, they reflect their mindset in terms of the relationship with technology. And so something that is legally compliant with the AI Act, with data protection, etc., it doesn't mean that it can be accepted by a society. So for this reason, it's important to investigate also the aspect of social ethical impact and using participatory tools. You have more here in the book on this topic, and this is the article that I mentioned that is just now is under peer review, but is already available on open access and as a preprint. And there is a specific consideration about the methodology of fundamental rights impact assessment and interpretation Article 27. Thank you.
Moltíssimes gràcies, Alessandro. Compartim el micro. No, el micro que hi ha per la sala serà per les preguntes. Ara donem pas a les preguntes i als comentaris, d'acord? Si tenim, encara que sigui 5-10 minuts, sí?
Jo no tinc.
Thank you for hello. Yeah. Thank you for the talk. I have two observations and one question. So I'm also concerned with the future of truth. So yeah, I believe that no one that tries to prompt one of these large language models is seeking for truth. They're just seeking for speed, immediate answers, and they don't care about the reasoning behind. So it's because maybe we live in a society that lacks out of critical thinking. And I believe that we should try to re-educate people that uses this kind of tools, not only AI-based tools, but any kind of tool that has no explainable resources behind. That's one. The other observation is concerning colonization, right? So I believe that we are siliconized, as Saddam said. But I believe that in here there is a lack of responsibility for governments. So we are colonized because they allow these companies to introduce their products in your mobile under this false idea of free of will. So you are an adult, you can install in your telephone whatever you want. But then the government did nothing, or the Russell did nothing on that. So now we are trying to patch the problem.
Okay.
So now the question. Those were two observations.
Yeah, okay.
And the main question is regarding this assessment technology, right? So indeed, I believe that is good self-assessment. But then I don't believe that you can self-assess a technology that is not created by certified producers. And I mean, in the case of computer science, and you said so, anyone using tools can produce an AI product that is basically a software product. So the issue is that no one has to sign a computer program. As an engineer signs a process, an architect signs a house, or a clinician when they receive you some treatment has some legal responsibilities behind. So the issue is again the governments that allow anyone that has access to a computer to produce programs that can be placed on the market. So I would like to have a reflection on that.
Podemos tomar otras. Vamos a contestar todos. Sí, hay otras. Sí. Bueno, eso es. ¿Prefieres en inglés o en castellano? En catalán, lo siento, no. Me gustaría, pero. ¿En inglés? Sígueme en inglés. There are some aspects. The first about trust, the consideration about class and colonization. Trust is a great problem the fact is not so easy to solve that through education, because education needs time. So if you look at TV, you look at internet, and you look at AI, the time in terms of technology development became shorter and shorter. From TV to internet, you had more or less 30, 40 years. From internet to AI, you had more or less 30 years. And from AI to general AI, you had, it depends what it means, AI, but we can say, if you consider the last version of AI, general AI, we have a few years. So everything is going so fast that the education has some limitation in terms of having time for the people to be educated. This is an issue. For this reason, in the act and more in general in the debate on digital regulation, we rely more on risk management, because risk management is the idea. It's like a car. You buy a car, but you don't understand how a car works, or it's not a requirement. You trust that those that create the car have done things in the right way. So, and this is related to your points about the assessment. So the idea of the assessment and the self-assessment is based on the idea that those that create the machine take on their shoulder the liability and assess the risk. But the assessment is strictly related to accountability. So it's not just something that you put on your table and stay there. It's something that you have to make available for supervisory authority, or you have to transmit to supervisory authority. So in this sense, for instance, this is also true for fundamental rights impact assessment. So they should be transmitted in terms of results to the authorities. So the fact is that the self-assessment can address, and is in line with this, can address this issue, is in line with the idea of industry regulation. The fact that this assessment is done by people that are not certified, we can say, etc., open a quite complicated debate. Personally, I'm not in favor of the certification of the expert for two reasons. The first reason, I recall a debate with the colleagues in the commission. The first problem that we have not to create an excessive bureaucracy. Because the tendency from the European Union sometimes is to transform everything in a bureaucratic process. So certification for AI product, certification for those that certify AI, certification for those that certifies AI. At the end, we have tons of paper and not an effective protection in some case. Unfortunately, in the financial sector, we already seen some of this materialization of risk, we can say. So in this sense, but here it's not just this general consideration, also because there's a huge debate about who have to certify. For instance, for conformity assessment, the OEIAC say CNELET, but CNELET have no any idea about fundamental rights because they certify irons or other things, so they're not exactly in the same field. And so it's also a problem of the certifying bodies, the democracy and the participation in certified bodies. So there are many issues. But I think one of the major objections is based on the fact that we have not one expert for an AI system. So are not to properly design AI system, maybe it's an AI system that have an impact on society. You have not just the computer scientist. You need the computer scientist, you need the social scientist, you need a different kind of expertise. If not, we come back to the previous case that I mentioned, which is a misunderstanding of the system, misunderstanding of society, and a bad match between the two. So in this sense, I feel difficult to certify some expert in this field because there is not one specific expertise. But when you create systems that are impactful system, of course, if you have a very stupid application, that's not a big issue. But stupid application doesn't mean small application, because, for instance, we have a small application that have an impact. There are applications that are companion AI, for instance. You talk with AI. And there are some of these companion AI that create problem of depression and people that suicide after this interaction, or create system of dependency, but so in terms of social impact, it's quite significant. Although if you look at tool from AI perspective, from engineering perspective, it's quite stupid tool. It's just a chatting box and nothing more. But the problem is exactly that as an engineer, you consider that as a stupid tool. This is just a chatting bot, do not consider the problem, the dependence of the people, the fragility of the target, all these consequences, and then the people suicide, or the people have depression, etc. So in this context, I think that it's very difficult to certify all these kind of skills that vary according to the AI system, vary according to the impact, etc. For this reason, I prefer the approach, at least of the OEIAC, in which not just the certification, but the risk assessment in broad sense is focused on the product. So it's not my interest to know who work in the project, what are the skills of those that work on the project, but for me it's important that the risk is mitigated. Then if you mitigate properly the risk with the 3 engineers that have also social background that can understand the problem, it's okay. If you mitigate the risk because you have a team with a lot of experts, okay. So this is I think because on the other hand, it's very difficult to create a system certification because who are the experts? So there are many varieties. You disagree, but we can discuss.
I have a question, but I'm going to do it in Spanish because I think it's quite
Yeah,
difficult for me
Spain,
to try to to develop inside my mind.
Yeah.
So it's according to es referente es referente a la educación.
Okay.
Está cambiando todo tan rápido que cómo podrían actuar las universidades y los estamentos educativos para poder reeducar a la gente que viene detrás y a las personas que tienen una formación baja y que necesitan aprender estas nuevas tecnologías para poder no quedarse afuera del sector económico y laboral. O sea, ¿cuál es la implicación de las universidades y de los institutos educativos ahora mismo? Porque entiendo que una universidad es inmensa y mover todo este pensum y poder acomodarse a las nuevas demandas que cambian tan rápidamente es challenging, pienso yo.
Sí, hay varias cosas. A mí me gusta también español. Hay varias cosas. Lo primero es que el reskilling es diferente desde crear nueva conocimiento, digamos. Aquí el problema que tenemos es que muchas veces estos sistemas van a impactar sobre algunas profesionalidades. Y es verdad que crean otras profesionalidades. Los políticos dicen, no hay problema. Sí, pero hay problema, porque son diferentes. Si tú vas a utilizar Generative AI y el Generative AI te permite de reasumir las informaciones que te proporcionan las agencias de prensa, tú puedes construir un periódico online, un blog online de manera completamente automatizada sin tener periodista o algo similar a un periodista que va a supervisionar o a crear el contenido. Y eso se ha visto en Italia. Cuando se paró ChatGPT por algunos meses en Italia, había blog que ponían, este blog está en pausa, digamos, porque está parado ChatGPT. Básicamente no había nadie sino ChatGPT que crea contenido. Eso es. Y en este contexto, el papel de la universidad es un poco complicado, porque nosotros necesitamos tiempo para educar, necesariamente. Y podemos hacer varias cosas. La primera, claro, ya lo estamos haciendo, crear cursos que proporcionan conocimiento por esta casi nuevo sector, digamos. Pero aquí tenemos también, yo lo veo en la Politécnica, donde yo tengo mi cátedra. El problema es que la universidad no tiene un papel de un curso de formación. La universidad tiene que formar sobre grandes retos y grandes frameworks, digamos. Porque si vamos a ir de atrás a la tecnología y a cada cambio vamos a cambiar el curso, nunca llegamos. Claro, alguna tecnología nueva tenemos que introducirla. No podemos seguir hablando de sistemas expertos cuando tenemos redes neurales, eso lo entiendo. Pero al mismo tiempo no podemos seguir la última novedad en términos de inteligencia artificial. Hacer cursos muy puntuales sobre eso no funciona. Funciona más cuáles son los retos, cuáles son los problemas. Por ejemplo, yo tengo un curso en Data Scientist está enfocado sobre ética y protección de datos que se aplica y cada año cambia cambiando un poco lo que pasa en la tecnología. La universidad proporciona enseñanza básica, digamos, de grande perspectiva. Después uno va afinándola en la práctica, en el concreto y todo. Por otro lado, podemos tener cursos más específicos, que ser cursos de máster o curso profesionalizante, digamos, sobre algunos casos, como puede ser el impacto sobre los derechos fundamentales y todos. Así que la oferta se puede manejar de esta manera, pero el problema que yo no creo podemos enfrentar es reskilling, porque los periodistas que dejan de trabajar porque hay ChatGPT, no es que el día siguiente van a programar ChatGPT. Ese es el problema. Es bastante difícil. Todo sector creativo, por ejemplo, que en parte está afectado por el uso de la inteligencia generativa, eh, no es que se puede recalificar haciendo cosas diferentes, digamos. Si tú pones una musiquita en un sitio web, antes pagaba los derechos a un autor, ahora te lo hace con inteligencia generativa y no paga nada, pero el autor no es que puede hacer algo diferente. Así que lo veo difícil. Otra cosa que podemos hacer como universidad y trabajar, y ya lo estamos haciendo, en el comité de ética y de investigación, más sobre el tema de los problemas de inteligencia artificial. Eso también se está haciendo a nivel europeo. El mes que viene, creo, sí. Tengo que enviar un informe a la unidad de la Unión Europea de la Comisión que está haciendo las nuevas directrices sobre la evaluación de los proyectos europeos. En esta directriz habrá un capítulo específico sobre la evaluación de impacto sobre los derechos fundamentales de la inteligencia artificial. Como ustedes saben, de momento, cuando se va a enviar a submitir una propuesta europea, hay casi nada sobre la inteligencia artificial. Hay un par de preguntas y hay referencia a la directriz del High Level Group on Artificial Intelligence que digamos, tenían ya algunos límites desde el principio y además ahora no están muy relacionados con la estructura de la EAC. Por eso la Unión Europea ha decidido de crear un aparato específico para la ética y para la evaluación de impacto sobre los derechos fundamentales en el programa que ve futuro de investigación. Así que habrá eso. Yo veo esas tres directrices para enfrentarse al problema.
Perfecte. Tenim una última pregunta.
Gracias. Sí, está conectado, ¿no? Vale. Muchas gracias por la charla. ¿En inglés o en español?
Como quieras.
Whatever, ok. Yo creo sinceramente que el problema no es de educación, es de narrativa con el neoliberalismo. Entonces, creo que cuando nos estamos enfocando en la educación, el reskilling o las cosas que estamos hablando, nos estamos enfocando en acciones tácticas cuando creo que el problema es estratégico y de big picture. De hecho, creo que no solamente el neoliberalismo, sino también los modelos de negocio, donde estamos respondiendo como borregos a modelos de negocio. Y ya no solamente los modelos de negocio que vemos de manera evidente, que sería la captación masiva de datos, etcétera, etcétera, sino que hay varios modelos de negocio de los cuales yo veo que Europa no está hablando. Por ejemplo, el hype es necesario para los inversores hacerse ricos, porque el hype lo que hace es que crea que la población cree que una tecnología funciona y eso es lo que hace rico a un inversor, no que realmente funcione. Entonces, los diferentes modelos de negocio, que son muchos, no vamos a hablar de ellos ahora, y el neoliberalismo son el gran problema que está ocasionando todo este tipo de acciones tácticas que yo creo que nos estamos enfocando más en el árbol que en el bosque ahora mismo. En realidad es un comentario más que una pregunta.
Estoy de acuerdo. hay varias consideraciones. Lo primero, es verdad que estamos en una época de neoliberalismo, pero a consecuencia de ello, la ley sigue el modelo dominante. Eso que pasa siempre en la historia, digamos, si hay modelo dominante en el sector económico, en la sociedad, la ley no va a crear la sociedad, la ley representa la sociedad, básicamente. Así que tenemos una sociedad en la cual el éxito económico, lo que se llama tecnosolucionismo, ¿no? Una solución técnica para cada cosa, son la mirada que tenemos ahora sobre la tecnología. Europa en este contexto tiene una cultura más amplia, parecida a otras áreas, y por eso también en el OEIAC, en el debate, hay elementos de diferente perspectiva, digamos. Este enfoque sobre los derechos fundamentales, la idea de algunas líneas rojas, la idea de regulación, eh, hacen de Europa un área, digamos, más contendida. No la veo típicamente neoliberista. Me parece que mirando atrás al pasado histórico de Europa, se tiene en cuenta también que la tecnología tiene problemas, que el- la confianza total en la tecnología y en las posibilidades de tecnología tiene que ser más crítica, digamos, con una mirada más crítica, teniendo en cuenta los riesgos, los problemas. Y por otro lado, es verdad que hay un hype, como hubo un hype con el blockchain, como hubo un hype con varias tecnologías, y eso es un efecto de una estrategia, una narrativa, una estrategia económica de Estados Unidos y de California, básicamente, que intenta ganar dinero claramente y porque se dice no puede vivir sin inteligencia generativa. Lo problema aquí que tenemos es parecido un poco a lo que pasó con el blockchain, que de momento se hace mucha inversión en el AI, en el AI generativa, pero la aplicación, digamos, que pueda crear un negocio rentable, de momento no se ha encontrado. Ahora está funcionando todo porque grandes corporaciones como Microsoft y todo están poniendo mucho dinero, pero perdiendo dinero, ¿no? OpenAI dice, no me importa perder dinero, yo puedo perder dinero cuanto puedo porque me gusta invertir en este sector, estoy convencido que será útil, claro, hasta que Microsoft pague. Pero el problema es que este modelo que se basa sobre hype, se basa su promoción, su crear necesidades de utilizar herramientas que antes no utilizamos, ¿no? Porque claramente se van a crear nuevas necesidades, pero si no es rentable, al final no funciona. El problema que ahora tenemos en el AI es que algunas aplicaciones son rentables, otras no son rentables. En inteligencia, la parte, digamos, de Generative AI es la más problemática porque tiene sesgos, es problemas que no están resueltos y eso afecta mucho el hecho que una empresa o sector público pueda dotarse de esta herramienta. Así que la IP, coincido, es una forma de aprovechar, digamos, del interés por el tema, crear expectativas y ganar mucho dinero por algunos meses. Pero vamos a ver cuánto sigue esto, hype, porque si en tiempo, digamos, razonable no encuentra una aplicación que justifica toda esta inversión, al final no es sostenible econòmicamente. Després.
No, hauríem d'anar acabant. Llavors, sí, en tot cas, si ja teniu més preguntes i comentaris, en tot cas, ara hi haurà l'oportunitat per fer-ho a fora. Jo abans d'acabar, per això, volia, en primer lloc, agrair a Alessandro Mantelero la seva xerrada i una xerrada que heu pogut veure no va només de legislació, va de moltes més coses, defensa de drets, fins i tot economia i fins i tot això que ens ha recordat, que la legislació no està per canviar la societat, tot i que hi ha una certa controvèrsia, no?, també sobre això, perquè pot tenir un paper. Però en qualsevol cas ha estat també un cert debat amb unes preguntes que posen les coses, com aquell diria, doncs allà on a un també li agraden, que és amb l'impacte social i en com fins a certa mesura hi ha uns elements que s'han de considerar que van molt més enllà del que és la burocràcia, la legislació i el context, i és, evidentment, l'economia. I un lloc com la Facultat d'Econòmiques també s'ha de parlar d'aquestes coses perquè els models econòmics que imperen a vegades no són potser els que voldríem. Per tant, en primer lloc, moltes gràcies de nou a Alessandro Mantelero i que no m'oblidi de dues coses. La primera té a veure amb la propera xerrada del cicle OEIAC, que tindrà lloc el dia 10 de juny a les 5 i que comptarem, aquesta vegada serà streaming, fins que no arribi al final de curs tot serà en línia, i que comptarem amb una persona que és de Derechos Digitales, una persona que ve de Brasil i que tracta sobre la defensa dels drets des de Llatinoamèrica, un context que és molt diferent, però que en certa mesura ens hauria també de fer pensar de quina manera des d'un altre lloc del món s'entoma aquest repte que és la defensa dels drets i especialment de comunitats molt vulnerables, no només a Brasil sinó al conjunt de Llatinoamèrica. I després veureu que hi ha altres xerrades, algunes que tenen més a veure amb privacitat, altres que tenen a veure amb la participació, altres que tenen a veure amb això que és l'avaluació. I l'últim missatge, una mica agafant això que ens diu el professor Mantelero, i és que sí, evidentment, hi ha qüestions que ens les certificaran o no, des de fora, però nosaltres hem de ser més conscients de com avaluem aquestes tecnologies com a usuaris. I per això, com a usuaris, fins i tot com a persones que cada tenim més coneixement, l'autoavaluació cada serà més important. I d'aquí unes setmanes, si em permeteu, veureu que hi ha un nou model PIO que passa a la fase de beta a una nova beta, que serà el nou model PIO sobre obligacions i drets, per tant, obligacions en relació a la legislació, però també sobre drets, perquè, evidentment, com podem veure, aquest és un tema ben important. Doncs res més. Moltes gràcies per venir a tots vosaltres, moltes gràcies per seguir-nos per streaming i ara tenim un refrigeri aquí fora per acabar la sessió. Gràcies.